Next section, we're actually going to start on our specialized senses. And the first one we're going to do is olfaction. So if you take a look at the diagram you have in your notes, I have it actually labeled here. This is a sagittal section of the head. And the first thing I want to point out here, as you guys are copying this down, is these tree root looking things that I have circled. These are actually nerve fiber endings, and this is what we refer to as the olfactory epithelium. Now these nerve fibers come together, and if you see, they actually bundle coming up in the yellow there, and those are the nerve fibers. These nerve fibers, as you can see, actually pass through the skull bone. There's actually little holes in our skull that allow these nerves to pass. Now the next one that they go into should kind of sound familiar because you just saw these on Wednesday when you did the sheep brain dissection. These are the olfactory bulbs, and so now you can kind of see how it relates in terms of the brain and spatially where it relates and why those bulbs are so far forward on the brain. Okay, that olfactory bulb is where those nerves actually feed into, and then they pass out of there into the olfactory tract, which leads to the processing center of the brain. You can also see from this diagram why that cerebrospinal fluid is so important to make that brain float, because this is a perfect example here with that olfactory bulb that if it didn't float, it would actually compress that olfactory bulb and we can actually lose our sense of smell. Now the second diagram here, basically what we do is we go and, I'm sorry, I'm probably making you guys seasick. We're pulling out this little square here on the nose. So that's what we're going to be looking at next. If I can get it to pull down for me. All right, there we go. So we're looking at now things, we've first looked at the gross anatomy of the area. Now we're looking at the microscopic anatomy. So here what we're doing is we're basically taking a look at the place between the skull bone here at the top, down to the loose nerve endings there. And so we're taking a look here at this whole section would be considered the olfactory epithelium. Okay. So we start here, yes, we've got the skull bone, and then attached to the skull bone is some loose connective tissue. Remember, we have to actually connect the epithelium to the underlying tissues, and that's what the loose connective tissue does. The olfactory epithelium is this grouping here. All right, this whole layer here, this outer layer. Now, sticking out of that outer layer, you can see we've got some olfactory cilia here. That's also the name for those nerve endings. Okay, there is cilia on those cells, but there is also those free nerve endings. And what happens is those little dots represent odorant molecules, and then the kind of tan-colored stuff here is the mucus that's actually within the surface of your nasal cavity. What happens is those odorant molecules actually have to dissolve within the mucus in order to trigger an action potential within those nerve fibers. This cell here is what we call a supporting cell, and what it is supporting is the olfactory receptor cell here. It's a nerve cell. Okay, the basal cell here, again, that's a type of stem cell that actually regenerates more supporting cells because these do die. These are kind of like the glial cells for that olfactory receptor cells. This is a nerve fiber, so the receptor cell axons kind of come together and they pass through the skull bone. I think that is it. Let me just check. The only one that's not on here is this one, and that is referred to, let's see if I can actually write on here. I've been having some problems. This part, let's try. Oops. This one here. It's called the Bowman's. You can see why I wasn't able to write this out. All right, we'll stop that here. Bowman's, Bowmans, and that is the capsule. Okay, so that indent here is called the Bowman's capsule. Okay, so we've got our pieces and parts here. We've got the basal cell that regenerates our receptors. We have the supporting cell that actually helps take care of those receptor cells. Our olfactory receptor cells are one of the few types of nerve cells that actually do regenerate. All right, so let me get over to this then. All right. So what we want to do, now that we've looked at the anatomy, I'm actually going to trace what we call the olfactory pathway. So in other words, how does our sense of smell actually work? Well, the first step, and I kind of mentioned this before, is that the odorants actually have to diffuse into the mucus. Otherwise, we actually won't be able to sense that odor. Those odorants then actually, because they are dissolved, they can actually attach to receptors on the outside of the receptor cell, olfactory cilia there, and they bind with those proteins on their surface. Just to give you an idea in terms of the receptor density, we have about 10 to 20 million receptor cells in about a 5 square centimeter area. So, 5 square centimeters is about the size of one of my blocks up on my calendar, up on the front board. So we've got between 10 to 20 million receptor cells. Just to give you a comparison, a dog has about 200 million receptor cells in that same area. So you can see why certain animals like dogs can actually have a better sense of smell than we do. They have more receptor cells. Then the action potential gets generated on the receptor membrane. So once those odorant molecules bind with those detector proteins, as long as enough of them bind, we start to generate an action potential. This is a nerve impulse. Okay, and then the impulse gets relayed into the central nervous system through the olfactory bulb, and it gets interpreted. Basically, these smells can produce both behavioral as well as emotional responses, depending on the smell. I can remember a couple years ago I was making some snacks for for a birthday party that we were having in the fall, and it was a type of Chex Mix, and I usually don't make Chex Mix all the time, and my younger daughter actually walked into the kitchen and she took a deep breath and she said, "The house smells like Christmas." And so, she associated that smell with Christmas time. So it actually elicited an emotional response in her. And we have that kind of all the time. All right, I know this one was a short one, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over and get everything ready here for our taste pathway and our taste labels of our diagrams.